step into the shadows of childhood innocence as we unravel the bone-chilling truth behind one of history's most beloved nursery rhymes. Ring Around the Rosie, a playful circle game that has echoed through playgrounds for centuries, conceals a horrifying tale of death, disease, and desperation that will forever change how you hear children's laughter. Welcome back to the dark corners of history, where we excavate the buried secrets of seemingly innocent traditions. Today, we venture into the plague-ridden streets of medieval Europe to expose the macabre origins of a rhyme that has haunted generations, disguised as harmless child's play. The year was 1347 when death arrived on merchant ships, carried by fleas on the backs of rats. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, swept across Europe like a merciless reaper, claiming between 75 and 200 million lives. In this apocalyptic landscape of suffering and terror, desperate people clung to any ritual that might ward off the inevitable darkness creeping toward their doors. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. These seemingly innocent words mask a chilling documentation of humanity's darkest hour, when entire families vanished overnight and mass graves overflowed with the rotting corpses of plague victims. The first line, Ring Around the Rosie, refers to the characteristic rosy red rash that appeared in circular patterns on the skin of plague victims. This crimson herald of death marked the beginning of an agonizing journey toward the grave. Medieval physicians, helpless against the mysterious disease, could only watch as these telltale rings spread across their patients' flesh, like blooming flowers of doom. As the infection progressed, victims developed painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes, primarily in the groin, armpit, and neck. These grotesque swellings, often as large as apples, turned black and leaked pus and blood, creating a nauseating spectacle that terrified even the most hardened witnesses. The stench of decay filled homes and streets as the living struggled to tend to the dying. The pocket full of posies represents the desperate attempts of medieval people to protect themselves from what they believed was poisonous air or miasma that carried the plague. Lavender, thyme, rosemary, and other aromatic herbs were stuffed into small pouches and carried close to the body, their sweet fragrance intended to mask the overwhelming smell of death that permeated every corner of plague-stricken communities. Physicians donned terrifying bird-like masks filled with herbs and spices, creating an image that haunted the nightmares of plague survivors for generations. These grotesque figures, resembling harbingers of death themselves, moved through streets littered with corpses, their long beaks filled with aromatic substances they hoped would purify the corrupted air they breathed. The third line, Ashes, ashes, holds the most chilling truth of all. In some versions, it's rendered as a tissue, mimicking the violent sneezing fits that preceded death in pneumonic plague victims. However, the more sinister interpretation refers to the cremation of countless plague victims, whose bodies were burned in massive pyres that sent columns of ash and smoke into the darkened skies above medieval cities. Traditional burial practices collapsed under the sheer volume of death. Graveyards overflowed, and the church's sacred rituals became impossible to maintain. Bodies were collected daily by death carts, their wheels creaking ominously through empty streets as drivers called out the now legendary phrase, "Bring out your dead." The accumulated corpses were then burned en masse, creating apocalyptic scenes of towering flames and drifting ash that blocked out the sun. The final line, "We all fall down," represents the ultimate fate that awaited entire communities. Families, neighborhoods, and sometimes entire villages succumbed to the plague's relentless advance. Children watched their parents collapse and die, only to follow them into the grave within days. The phrase captures the sudden, inevitable collapse that marked the end of countless lives during those dark years. Historical records describe scenes of unimaginable horror. In London, entire households were found dead behind barred doors. In Florence, Boccaccio wrote of seeing 2 pigs root through the rags of a plague victim, only to writhe in agony and die within hours. The social fabric of medieval Europe disintegrated as survivors abandoned moral codes in their desperate struggle to stay alive. Some historians argue that the rhyme predates the Black Death, suggesting connections to even earlier plagues or pagan rituals. However, the imagery perfectly aligns with contemporary accounts of plague symptoms and medieval responses to the pandemic. The oral tradition that preserved this rhyme ensured its survival through centuries of retelling, each generation unknowingly passing down a memorial to one of humanity's greatest catastrophes. The psychological impact of the Black Death cannot be overstated. Survivors lived in constant terror, never knowing when the crimson rings might appear on their own flesh. Parents watched helplessly as their children developed the telltale rash, knowing death would follow within days. The nursery rhyme became a way to process this collective trauma, transforming unspeakable horror into a manageable childhood game. Medieval chronicles describe the breakdown of civilization itself. In Siena, construction of the cathedral ceased permanently when workers died at their posts. In England, entire villages were abandoned, their empty houses slowly reclaimed by nature. The economic system collapsed as trade routes closed and agricultural production plummeted due to massive population losses. Religious faith was shaken to its core as prayers went unanswered and holy men died alongside sinners. Some believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, leading to extreme religious movements like the flagellants, who whipped themselves bloody in public displays of penance. Others turned to witchcraft and superstition, desperately seeking any protection against the invisible enemy that stalked their communities. The phrase, "ring around the Rosie," took on additional meanings as families created protective circles during their final moments together. Holding hands in desperate unity, they faced death as one, their last act a defiant gesture of love against the darkness that consumed them. These human circles became symbols of both vulnerability and strength, reflecting humanity's eternal struggle against mortality. Archaeological evidence supports the rhyme's connection to plague years. Mass burial sites across Europe reveal the hurried, unceremonious disposal of countless victims. In London, the Bedlam burial ground contained over 20,000 bodies stacked in layers, testament to the overwhelming scale of death that necessitated such desperate measures. The transformation of this horror into a children's game represents a remarkable example of cultural adaptation. By converting trauma into play, communities found a way to remember their darkest hour without passing on the full weight of that suffering to future generations. The circular dance becomes a ritual of remembrance, preserving historical truth while protecting childhood innocence. Modern scholars debate whether children who played this game throughout subsequent centuries understood its sinister origins, or whether the knowledge was deliberately hidden to spare young minds from contemplating such darkness. The plague's impact extended far beyond immediate mortality. Entire bloodlines were extinguished, taking with them centuries of accumulated knowledge, skills, and traditions. Master craftsmen died before passing on their techniques. Scholars perished with their discoveries unrecorded, and families that had endured for generations vanished without trace. Social hierarchies crumbled as death struck regardless of class or station. Kings and peasants fell equally before the plague's advance, creating unprecedented opportunities for social mobility among survivors. The severe labor shortage that followed fundamentally altered economic relationships, leading to increased wages for workers and the eventual decline of feudalism. The rhyme's international variations reveal its widespread cultural impact. In Germany, similar verses reference the pest, while French versions allude to the grande mortalité. Each culture adapted the basic structure to reflect their own experience of plague devastation, creating a tapestry of shared trauma expressed through children's games. Medieval medical texts describe the progression of plague symptoms with clinical precision that matches the rhyme's imagery. The appearance of rose-colored rings preceded the development of buboes, which then blackened and burst, releasing infectious material that contaminated everything nearby. The final stage brought high fever, delirium, and the characteristic respiratory distress that made victims gasp for air before succumbing. Artists of the period documented the plague's horrors in paintings and manuscripts that show death dancing with kings and commoners alike. The dance macabre became a popular artistic theme, reflecting society's obsession with mortality during these dark years. These visual records complement the oral tradition preserved in nursery rhymes, creating a comprehensive documentation of historical trauma. The psychological mechanisms that transform terror into play demonstrate humanity's remarkable resilience. By encoding survival information in memorable, rhythmic verses, communities ensured that future generations would retain crucial knowledge about recognizing plague symptoms, even if the specific historical context was forgotten. Some versions of the rhyme include additional verses that reference specific plague prevention methods, or describe the appearance of death carts and mass cremations. These extended versions, preserved in isolated communities, provide even more detailed glimpses into the daily reality of living through humanity's greatest pandemic. The gradual evolution of Ring Around the Rosie from historical documentation to innocent children's game illustrates how collective memory adapts to serve different purposes across generations. What began as a desperate attempt to understand and cope with unprecedented death became a way to teach children about community, cooperation, and the cyclical nature of life and death. Linguistic analysis reveals that the rhyme's structure and rhythm optimize it for memorization, ensuring its survival through oral tradition even when literacy rates were extremely low. The simple, repetitive pattern made it accessible to children while encoding complex historical information in a format that could survive centuries of retelling without significant corruption. The game's physical component, joining hands in a circle and falling down together, creates a shared experience that bonds participants while reenacting the historical reality of families and communities dying together during plague outbreaks. This embodied memory preserves emotional truth even when historical facts become obscured. Regional variations of the rhyme provide insight into how different communities experience the plague. Areas that suffered more severe outbreaks tend to preserve versions with darker imagery, while regions that escaped the worst devastation developed lighter adaptations that emphasized playfulness over historical accuracy. The rhyme's persistence through centuries of social change demonstrates its effectiveness as a vehicle for cultural transmission. During times when written records were scarce and literacy limited, these rhythmic verses served as repositories of crucial information, ensuring that knowledge of history's darkest chapters would not be completely lost. Modern epidemiologists studying historical pandemics have found nursery rhymes like Ring Around the Rosie to be surprisingly accurate sources of information about disease symptoms and social responses. These seemingly innocent children's games preserve details that complement official records, providing a more complete picture of how past societies coped with existential threats. The transformation of trauma into play represents a fundamental human coping mechanism that continues to operate in contemporary society. Just as medieval communities converted their plague experience into children's games, modern cultures create entertainment from historical disasters, suggesting that this process serves essential psychological functions in processing collective trauma. As we face our own global challenges, Ring Around the Rosie reminds us that even our darkest hours can be transformed into something that brings joy to future generations, even as it preserves the memory of those who suffered and died in humanity's struggle against forces beyond their control.